The only way you get a deal this calendar year, so we're talking about what, 10 months from now, 10 and a half months, well, 11 and a half months from now, is if Putin relatively soon, let's say relatively, let's define relatively soon as 4 to 6 weeks, begin to see that, well, maybe he's not going to be able to make any real significant military gains going forward. And that only happens if we bring the boom down on him. And you can start that with economic sanctions, but it really has to be military steps on the ground. So again, a restarting of American supplies, so Ukraine does not have to hoard its weapons to have something for 4 months from now if there's no additional American military support this year, and weapon systems that will make a clear difference on the ground straight away.
Do you think that fear of escalation that has been there really since the start of the full-scale invasion, that has been shown to be a bluff by Putin? Is that your view, Ambassador?
Um, the Ukrainians, NATO, countries which joined NATO, I'm talking now, of course, about Finland and Sweden, all passed multiple Kremlin red lines, which did not lead to one mushroom cloud in the sky. So Putin realized that his bluff with nukes was always useful at slowing us down from taking decisions that we should have taken earlier. Uh, you know, obviously, when you're in a confrontation with a nuclear power, you have to take seriously the possibility of nuclear escalation. But of course, the United States has had substantial experience with nuclear diplomacy, facing a more dangerous foe than Putin's Russia, meaning the Soviet Union, during the Berlin crisis in 61, the Cuban Missile Crisis a year later. And not once during those crises did the President of the United States or his National Security Advisor or Secretary of Defense or Secretary of State ever say, we can't do X publicly, they never said this publicly, because the Russians may go nuclear, the Soviets may go nuclear. So that's a very weak hook. And the former senior officials in the Biden administration are simply saying, oh, they were prudent, and people who talked about ignoring these threats are just being uh, rash. But those of us who advocated stronger measures were paying very close attention to what the Russians were doing and saying. And we knew that they did not have a death instinct, right? Because there was no danger in threatening nuclear use. There was extraordinary danger in actually using nuclear weapons.
What other options do you think the White House should keep on the table? I mean, what about a NATO enforced no-fly zone over Ukraine? I have no doubt Vladimir Putin wouldn't like that, but should Donald Trump keep that on the table?
I don't think that the Trump team is thinking about this. And while I would welcome it, I try to offer ideas that I think have a chance of working. Never let the ideal be an enemy of the good. So since I don't think that's flyable, so to speak, with the Trump folks, at least right now, I see no reason to offer that as a policy recommendation. Now, uh, 6 weeks from now, 3 months from now, if Putin is still being obstinate and negotiations haven't started, maybe the Trump team will begin to think even more boldly about this. In that case, a proposal like that could make perfect sense. Continued uh, Kremlin obstinacy could also persuade Trump to take another look at the idea of Ukraine joining NATO. Many things may prove to be possible for stronger American policy, for putting a revanchist Russia in a cage. They may be possible as the new administration realizes just how dangerous they are to our interests. But right now, these things are not on the table. And there's no reason to get into any detail.
We hope you're enjoying today's episode of Frontline. Don't forget, you can also now listen to Frontline in podcast form. Just search for The World in 10 from wherever you get your podcasts, where you can also hear daily analysis of the biggest stories relating to war and defence. And we'll put a link to The World in 10 in the description below. From your experience, Ambassador, if you had to frame an argument for Donald Trump about why continued American support for Ukraine is in his interest as a president, how would you frame that argument? Because a lot of observers think that Trump has never quite understood, in the way that certain other world leaders have, the imperative of supporting Ukraine.
Well, we have yet to see Donald Trump say, Putin and Russia are putting at risk major American interests. I think there are people in his policy team who understand that, believe that. Uh, Trump has thought in terms of deals that strengthen America, deals that weaken our adversaries. Now, it's an interesting thing that I believe for the first time, in connection with American policy in the Arctic, Trump identified Russia as an American adversary. I may be mistaken. Maybe he said this before, but I was unaware of that. But he's talking about our adversary ships in the Arctic Ocean, referring to the Chinese and the Russians. So maybe he's in the process of coming to understand that if Russia is able to win in Ukraine, that's a danger to critical American interests in Europe. What I just said, I think, is certainly true. Uh, and I think Trump may come to that. But at the moment, I'm not sure that he's there.
Yesterday, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping had a phone call. By all accounts, they re-emphasized their desire to cooperate on everything from foreign policy to energy to the economy. How worried are you,
Right.
Ambassador, about what appears to be a deepening alliance between Moscow and Beijing?
This is clearly an alliance based upon their desire to greatly weaken the United States. That's what this is all about. And of course, that partnership, it's really not an alliance, but it is certainly a partnership, is bolstered by their junior partners, North Korea and Iran. Uh, and they are working globally against American interests. Uh, China's support for Russia has been critical in this war. A, because they are supporting the Russian economy in the face of the sanctions we imposed now 3 years ago. And that support has been essential for the Russian economy. And of course, the Russian economy is essential for their war effort. Although China has been unwilling to directly challenge the sanctions, and so for example, to send weapons to Russia in a way that we all can see, uh, but still they're providing critical support. I believe that Xi, no less than Putin, uh, was unhappy with the fact that Russia did not take Ukraine in a week or two, that the Ukrainians have made Russia pay a major cost for their aggression. And I think while the West response, the American response to the Russian big invasion was not as strong as it should have been, both Putin and Xi were surprised, unhappily, that it was as strong as it was. And again, I mean, I always refer to the Biden team's policy as adequate because they did prevent a Russian victory, just not bold and maybe not sustainable over time. Uh, but we should, we can try. The Biden team tried to split Russia and Ukraine. That failed. You now hear talk about the Trump team trying to go to China to get them to tell Putin to stop the hostilities. I don't think the Chinese will deliver that message. They may, because they see a Putin that succeeds in Ukraine, as a Putin has dealt a major blow to American interests, American power, and American prestige, which of course is China's objective. And you have some very short-sighted people uh, in the Trump administration, not his major national security team, but others who've argued that we should not worry about Ukraine, we have to worry about Taiwan. And they don't understand, despite what the Japanese, the South Korean, and the Taiwanese leaders have said, that if you want to deter Xi on Taiwan, make sure Putin loses in Ukraine. That's another reason why it's vital for President Trump that Putin lose in Ukraine. But again, I think the policy is heading in the right direction, and I think we may see more decisive steps as President Trump realizes that Putin is working directly against American interests and President Trump's interests and President Trump's historic reputation.
Is there anything in your view that Trump could do to kind of pressure China to in turn pressure Russia? I mean, I'm wondering, for example, we've heard Donald Trump in the last 24 hours talk about his plans to impose tariffs on Chinese imports up to 10%. If he made potentially Xi Jinping conferring a message to Putin to come to the negotiating table a prerequisite for maybe a slightly less punitive tariff regime. Could that be a factor? Could that be on the table?
Well, I have certain views as to how different foreign actors will behave. I'm not always right. So I can understand the new team making that approach to China. And I could see China playing along to a certain extent, meaning encouraging such ideas, seeing what they can get for it. And, the Chinese have been very good for decades uh, in managing American and Western expectations vis-a-vis North Korea. And, saying, oh, yes, we'll talk to Pyongyang about this and that. But those who follow China's foreign policy closely know that nothing ever came of those Chinese efforts to moderate North Korean behavior. So I think we'd see a very similar kabuki theater, to mix up my Oriental partners, or not so much partners, uh, playing the game with Trump for a little while, say, oh, yes, we'll give this a try, having no real intention of taking the necessary steps that might force Putin to reconsider, meaning cutting back, purchases of Russian oil and gas, uh, ending the flow of dual-use technology. I don't think the Chinese would actually do that, but they may play along. Uh, but it would not. They would not take the necessary steps. They didn't do it on North Korea. I don't think that would prove to be successful. Let's put it that way. They make a try, sure, but understand this too would take more and more time for the initiative. I mean, they could start tomorrow, but if they're giving it 2 months to play out, well, that's 2 months where you're not going to have any deal, because you have to get Putin to negotiate first. And once that happens, he'll start to. The Russians historically are masters at delaying diplomacy because they don't want the negotiations in question to go anywhere while other things are happening. And Trump's talking about, he's just told Kellogg, take care of this in 3 months. I wish General Kellogg Godspeed, but the chances of that happening are not great, and they're only possible if our policy is decisive, energetic, and consistent.
Well, on the issue of timings, just finally, Ambassador, you mentioned Donald Trump and his team now coming out and saying they want this solved by April, in the first 100 days of the administration. I note your skepticism on that. Do you think we will get any deal by the end of this year?
Never say never. Start with that. All right. Let me give you one circumstance which could lead to a deal faster than I anticipate. Again, the Russian economy is going through some really difficult times. And you have some creditable economists who claiming the Russian economy is going to crater this calendar year. Some even saying earlier than the end of this calendar year. Others are saying next year. I've never accepted the IMF statistics that the Russian economy grew by 3% last year. Those are based upon Russian economic statistics. Like their Soviet predecessors, those statistics are not to be trusted. So conceivably, if that were to happen, that might force Putin to actually negotiate. But assuming that does not happen, I believe that's the safer assumption. The only way you get a deal this calendar year, so we're talking about what, 10 months from now, 10 and a half months, well, 11 and a half months from now, is if Putin relatively soon, let's define relatively soon as 4 to 6 weeks, begin to see that, well, maybe he's not going to be able to make any real significant military gains going forward. And that only happens if we bring the boom down on him. And you can start that with economic sanctions, but it really has to be military steps on the ground. And so again, a restarting of American supplies, so Ukraine does not have to hoard its weapons to have something for 4 months from now if there's no additional American military support this year, and weapon systems that will make a clear difference on the ground straight away. This would be consistent with some things Trump has said rhetorically, months ago. But making that point rhetorically is very different from making the concrete decision once you have the power to do so. I'm not pessimistic that Trump would not make that decision, but I think there has to be some sort of learning process before he moves in that direction.
Ambassador Johnny Herbst, we really appreciate your time and your insights and your analysis. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.